Amen. Sometimes we get so busy trying to get from one place to the next that we miss the gift of the journey itself and the people we meet along the way. The Arch in St. Louis, standing 690 feet tall on the banks of the mighty Mississippi, since the 60s has been known as the gateway to the West. It's been that unofficial marking point that transitions the eastern part of our country to the western part of our country. Flying across country, of course, you'd miss it, but anyone who's ever driven along that I-70 corridor knows that it is almost impossible to miss. Which was perhaps why, nearly a quarter century ago, 4 teenage boys from Kansas driving on their way to Chicago, passing through St. Louis, decided to make a little stop along the way. Noticing the arch, they impulsively decided to pull over to wander their way through downtown St. Louis, to park their borrowed minivan at the base of the arch, and to wait in line for the elevator to the top. It's not your typical elevator, of course, as this is not your typical structure. Instead, it's more like a train system that has several 6-person pods that people wait in that slowly clacks its way to the top. As they were only 4, that meant that they would have 2 people joining them. And as it so happens, as those 4 boys found their way into the pod, they were joined by a couple, the same couple that had been standing behind them in line, holding hands, whispering sweet nothing, showing lots and lots of affection. Sick. They were, by all accounts, your average normal couple, save for one tiny fact. You see, they were wearing full-on pajamas. Not like, are those pajamas, but like jammies. They were wearing their pajamas. And so as they got into the pod, the boys stared at the couple, and the couple stared at the boys, and then finally one of them, the one who would grow up to be a preacher, you know the type, finally decided he couldn't take it any longer. He just simply said to the couple, "So, what's with the pajamas?" To which the couple laughingly responded, "Well, we just got married last week, and this morning we decided we wanted to have breakfast together. We knew that there was a Cracker Barrel a mile east of us, and we wondered how long driving on back roads it would take us to find a Cracker Barrel going west." They left from Ohio that morning. None of the 4 boys remember the view from the top of the arch, but they'll never forget the trip there. Sometimes we get so busy trying to get from one place to the next, we miss the gift of the journey itself and the people we meet along the way. Jesus was traveling to Jerusalem. It's one of those basic facts of the gospel, so simple that we kind of miss it. Jesus was traveling to Jerusalem. He was on his way to Jerusalem. That is basically what the stories of the gospel tell, that journey from north to south, from Galilee to Jerusalem, from nativity to cross. And while we kind of prefer Christmas or Easter to ordinary time, the truth is, a lot happens in between. Stuff that we miss if we never pause long enough to pay attention to the journey. Of course, that moment of in between is not really comfortable for us. We don't really like to be in between something. We'd rather be at one place or not. We don't like that part of trying to get there. It's a little uncomfortable, though maybe some of us are there this morning. In between. Not quite at one place, but not yet at another. Maybe we can see in front of us that job or that health or that body, that thing that we're longing for, but we know we're not quite there yet. Truth be told, we're much more of a destination kind of people. We like to be there. We don't want to mess with in between. It's like when you move. You leave one place, but you're not quite yet at another. That's an uneasy moment. For us, we're destination people. We want to know the answer. If we have a question, we want to get the answer now. If we go into a store, we want to get the thing and then get out. If we hear a sermon, we need it to get straight to the point and not take us through downtown St. Louis on the way to Jerusalem. Point taken. But sometimes, friends, if we never pause long enough on that journey from cradle to grave, we miss the life between. We never pause long enough on that journey from cradle to grave. We miss the life between. And so today, we pause. Wherever we find ourselves on our journeys through life, some at a high moment, some at a low, we just pause together for a moment with Jesus that we might see something new on this wandering journey. Of course, the pause, as we know, often proves to be the hardest part. We, because we are so destination-minded, so destination-focused, just want to keep going, just keep swimming, just keep swimming. We want to keep going, find our way forward to get to that destination, but that's not always the way it works. We even built into our faith an idea of a pause. It's right there, one of the 10 Commandments. You shall honor the Sabbath and keep it holy. Honor the Sabbath. That is, we're called once a week, that is, once a week, to spend an entire day pausing. Not to appreciate all that we've done, but to recognize all that God has done for us. How many of us actually do it? How many of us honor the Sabbath, and not the go to Home Depot, clean the bathroom, mow the yard kind of Sabbath, but an actual Sabbath, a day in which we pause? What would it look like if we honored the Sabbath and kept it holy? What would it look like if we took one day out of the week to put down our phones? If we took one day out of the week to not check, not respond to email? What would it look like if we took one day of the week to not be so concerned with doing something, but rather just being someone? Only one way to find out. Jesus, of course, who had a pretty important job, paused on his journey. And in the pause was able to see something that others missed. We're told that on his way to Jerusalem, when he was in that region between Galilee and Samaria, he paused and noticed some people who were on the outskirts of town, and 10 lepers approached him. To be clear, 10 lepers, not leopards, approached him. That would make for a very different kind of a story. 10 lepers approached him. Only when he paused long enough to see them did they feel comfortable coming to him, keeping their distance. That's the way it works sometimes. Sometimes we get so busy trying to get from one place to the next that we miss the gift of the journey itself and the people we meet along the way. It's like when you're on the thruway and you're passing cars, or cars are passing you, depending on how you drive, and suddenly you come to a stop. Sure, you've seen these cars all the time, but suddenly you notice that there are people in them. Sometimes it's only in the pause that we see the people around us. These lepers were on the outside of the community. They were forced on the margins. They lived around the village gate because that's the only place they could be. You see, in the ancient world, leprosy could have referred to any number of skin diseases. They weren't particularly into epidemiology. They just knew that if you had something different about your skin, you were pushed to the margins. Before we shake our heads in consternation at the ignorance of those ancient peoples who would dare push people to the margins for something as arbitrary as differences of skin, perhaps we ought to look in the mirror. They, of course, were worried about disease. What are we worried about? It must be something, of course. How else could you explain the fact that there is such vast differences in access to health care, in income levels, in education? And the greatest predictor is often something as arbitrary as the differences in skin pigment. Jesus paused. He saw, and then he heard. That in and of itself seems to be a miracle. How easy it is for us to just move from the city to the suburbs, to find our way past east and west, driving right through, to not turn in particular directions because we never know what we're going to find. How easy it is to just ignore the issues and pretend like they're not there, to bury our heads in the sand, to not really see, but that doesn't, of course, make them go away. It just pushes them to the margins. Jesus saw, and he heard. The lepers cried out for mercy. Maybe they had done that with everybody who had passed by, or maybe they recognized who Jesus is and they cried out particularly for him. We don't actually know. All we know is that these 10 people, known only for their disease, cry out in need. And Jesus sees them, he hears them, and then he points them towards the way of life. He points them in love towards life again. He says, "Go and show yourselves to the priests." It's such a simple line that we would miss it. Go and show yourself to the priests. But in the ancient world, it was only the priests who had the ability to make them clean again. That is, to certify them as ready to be in the community, to show themselves. He was in that moment saying, you cannot stay on the margins. You don't deserve the margins. You have to find your way back to the center. Go and force them to see you. And on the journey, they were made clean. Not once they got there, but once they turned in the direction of life again, they were made clean. That is, they found their way back into the fullness of community. What would that look like for us? We often think of this as a miracle story, and maybe it is, but it's pretty unclear on that front. It doesn't say that Jesus healed them. It doesn't say that Jesus placed his hand on them. Just that these 10 who were on the margins of society, once they found their way again, were made clean. And one of them, a Samaritan, came back to say thank you. We get it, of course. We know what it's like to finally find our way out of all that suffering and angst. to then just go on our way. We don't want to look back. It's too painful to look back. Only we know from hard experience that it's sometimes only when we look back that we recognize just how far we've come. In this case, it's the Samaritan. That is the double whammy, a person who was not just on the outskirts for having a disease, but was on the outskirts for being from the wrong area. The one who knew he'd probably stay on the margins anyway, and yet he found a way to turn and say, thanks. As we know from our own experience, sometimes it's those who have the least that are the most grateful. Jesus says to the man, get up. Go on your way, for your faith has made you well. In some ways, this is the quintessential Christian story. It's the human story. It's the story of people who find themselves on the margins, outside, pushed away, separated from one another, who are longing for someone to see them, to hear them, to recognize them, to show them the way to life, who find the grace of God and in so doing find life again, only to discover that it's not a destination, but a journey. Friends, Christians are people of the way, not a destination, a way. Jesus Christ came to remind us that the way to life is the way of love. Full stop. We don't get to it and stop. We keep finding our way together. And in so doing, we find life together. We are moving, yes, towards a destination, but not at death. That destination is the kingdom of God, that place that we will all finally get to, when all of us love as Christ commanded, when we love God and love our neighbor as ourselves. In other words, we can't leave it to the newlyweds to go out of their way for the sake of love. We can't leave it to those others out there who are willing to take that detour for the sake of love. No, that is our job. But it will mean each and every one of us pausing for a moment in life. It will mean each and every one of us seeing the people around us. It will take each and every one of us erring on the side of love. The good news is that none of us are on this journey alone. And if you insist, you're welcome to wear your pajamas. Sometimes we get so busy trying to get from one place to the next that we miss the gift of the journey itself and the people we meet along the way.